Hello and welcome to this Interpreting Wine's first ever mindful drinking series. I am of course your host and podcast founder, Lawrence Francis. This 5-part series will air between episodes 301 and 305 on the channel, and what originally started as a focus on non-alcoholic drinks evolved into a much wider discussion around mindful drinking, which I think, as you'll see, is really the bigger point here, aside from whether a drink has alcohol in it or not. That being said, this series features a number of voices influencing the mindful drinking agenda by focusing on lower or no alcoholic drinks. We look at cocktails with the founders of the London Cocktail Week, and finish the series with a couple of brands who I think are making massive strides in this area. And without further ado, here is today's episode of the series. Today's episode of the podcast features Claire Warner of Aecorn Aperitifs. We hear her origin story and transition from the spirit world into Aecorn Aperitifs. We get an aperitif 101. We get a deep dive on the current state of the low ABV category, discuss the Aecorn range and market feedback, and look ahead for the NA category. Enjoy.
My name's Claire Warner. I'm the MD of Aecorn Aperitifs, which is the world's first non-alcoholic aperitif range, which was launched 12 weeks ago. So we are babies in the world of the non-alc. But we are the sister brand to Seedlip, which is the pioneer of the non-alcoholic category, which really sort of began sort of 3 and a bit years ago. So as a category, still pretty new. And I joined 18 months ago to help change the way the world drinks. And because we are an aperitif brand, we're specifically looking at how we can improve, enrich, enhance that non-drinking occasion, specifically where food is involved. And my background was sort of 15 years working for LVMH and specifically on Belvedere vodka. So I've kind of gone, I don't know, from the boozy side to the much less boozy side, but still very much focused on great product, great story, making products that are distinctive and unique and luxurious, essentially. Yeah, so a little bit of a mini bio. I've been working in the drinks industry for over 20 years, even though I look super young. But I have a face for radio. But yes, I've been in the industry for a couple of decades now, and I got into it by accident, which I think many people do. And I studied law and wanted to be a barrister, and quickly realised that I didn't have what it took to be a barrister. My objective was to really just run down the court steps, like very LA law, which shows my age. But yeah, so I worked in hospitality throughout my degree, and then once I graduated, stayed in hospitality. Really fell in love with cocktails and mixology and the industry itself. Wasn't really aware of the wonderful sort of brands and stories that sat on a back bar until I worked in a bar environment. And won a very big cocktail competition, which then, sort of cut a long story short, propelled me into the world of working firstly on 2 small Polish vodkas, and then I transitioned to work on Belvedere vodka in 2003, and then had a wonderful sort of career with Moet Hennessy, starting as an ambassador and then gradually ending up being in charge of producing the vodka itself. So the last 13 Belvederes were mine in collaboration with the distillery that is in Poland. And in that journey, I became sort of increasingly more interested in nature, and particularly because Belvedere, as a flavoured vodka brand, we at the time, well, still today, don't add anything artificial, so only fresh natural ingredients. So nature was very important to me as a way to sort of like communicate on the naturalness of that product. And that brought me into contact with a young man called Ben Branson, who's the founder of Seedlip. But this was actually before Seedlip, so about 7 years ago. And we sort of connected over our sort of mutual obsession about nature and biomimicry and biophilia, and, how we can mimic nature in industry. and in drinks in particular. And sort of as an extension of nature, I became interested in health and wellness, and then was really sort of excited by this idea of trying to combine health and the drinks industry, which a few years ago was sort of, they were mutually exclusive and you couldn't really be fit and healthy and, be in our industry. But, really forged a path in showing myself firstly, and then others how, you can have a long and healthy life in this industry. And because of that, I think once Ben launched Seedlip about 3 years ago, we worked very closely together because it was a great opportunity for me to talk about low and no ABV cocktails and everything that Ben was doing. And then about 2 years ago, Ben sent me an email that kind of stopped me in my tracks and basically said, I want to change the way the world drinks. I can't do it with Seedlip. I can't do it on my own. I'd really like for you to come and help me do that. And, if someone sends you an email and says, I want to change the world, I want you to help me, it'd be really difficult to say, no, thank you. And so I kind of said, absolutely, I'll jump on board and join you in this sort of great mission, which I really believe is an important mission and an important purpose. Because the industry is a great industry, but there's so much opportunity for us to develop an industry that actually supports people's choices more fully. And, alcoholic beverages have really held the monopoly for thousands of years. And as our desire to be more sort of conscious in what we consume increases, then I think the choices should increase and to support that. And what Seedlip have done is really sort of articulated that challenge of what do you drink when you're not drinking. And with Aecorn Aperitifs, what we hope to do is continue that conversation and provide more choice for more people whether they choose to drink or not. So that's kind of potted history.
Super interesting story, and there's a lot of things there that I think I'd like to sort of come back to later on. Lots of really things I'm interested in, and I think it would be great to share some of those here. I think I'd like to sort of just bring the story right bang up to date and kind of have another little deep dive on the aperitif category, because presumably you got the email, you're fired up, and you're going into starting Aecorn. However, I guess you had to do a bit of the left brain work, looking at the market and seeing, how we in this country, how we consume aperitifs, what our views are around aperitifs, what are the most popular ones out there, who might the competition be. So, I just sort of invite you to share, some of your findings from that research that you must have done before getting started.
Sure, okay. That's a great question. There's lots of layers to that question. I think, firstly, the concept of aperitif, particularly in the UK, is still relatively unknown. It's a word that we kind of recognise, but maybe can't define or don't associate with, because it's very much a European tradition. But if we say, do you fancy a drink before dinner, or should we whet our appetite, then we kind of recognise what that drink is and what that moment sort of represents. And so when we were creating Aecorn, we originally very much were influenced by the European aperitif tradition, but we also looked back into sort of 1600s sort of English recipes, English herbal recipes that were designed to sort of do the same sort of thing, stimulate digestion. So while the word is a very beautiful word, it's a European concept, but in the UK we still recognise that drink before dinner is an important sort of pause before you go and eat, and it kind of allows you maybe to enjoy your food more. So also, aperitif as a category is not defined. So an aperitif to you might mean something very different to me. So anything from a gin and tonic to a glass of champagne to an Aperol spritz to a Campari and soda, all of these sorts of drinks are what you might enjoy at that moment. And for us, what we saw is a great opportunity to create a range of products that met flavor profile, and also could behave in a way that could give people the kind of cues that they would expect from an aperitif moment. And the link between all of the acorns, and the important factor for aperitifs in general, is that, grapes are very, very important. Many European aperitifs are based on grapes, or wine, and bitterness. And the concept of the aperitif to awaken the appetite is very closely linked to alcohol, and people think, it's the alcohol that makes me hungry, and alcohol does serve that purpose, but bitterness also can do a wonderful job at making us prepare for food. And actually the 16th century recipes that we found in an English manuscript were non-alcoholic, and they were talking about digestion. So there's a real sort of history of non-alcoholic and herbal remedies that behave in the same way as the European alcoholic aperitif tradition does, so preparing us for food. So we were really interested in focusing on grape base and using bitterness to a greater or lesser extent throughout the range to give people various touch points, so that you could enjoy an aperitif but without the alcohol, and it would still behave in a very similar way. I think what we've seen in recent years is a desire for people to drink lower ABV products. And from that, we're seeing sort of a slight uptick in interest for aromatized wine, vermouth, and bitter liqueurs, which have been really promoted by, or we've become more aware of through the prevalence, I suppose, of the Aperol spritz. And I think if you said to people, do you know what Aperol is, they would maybe struggle to define what that is, unless you grew up with in Italy or with Aperol. And as a drink, it's quite a modern phenomena. But that concept of the spritz and when to have that drink, and the fact that it's refreshing when it's warm outside, all those things are, quite. There's a lot of ritual associated with that drink. And so I think that's probably the one that's sort of really dominated in recent years. And also this, I think probably the Negroni cocktail, which is very bitter and very complex and very sophisticated, has crossed over from being sort of the bartender favourite drink into more sort of mainstream, probably driven by Mad Men or sort of us talking about cocktail culture more and more. And it's such a simple drink to create. It's just, equal parts gin, sweet vermouth, and Campari, that you could make that at home and have a really delicious Negroni. And one of the things that Seedlip did before Aecorn came along was create a non-alcoholic version of that drink, which was the No-Groni. So very much sort of a mimic of the Negroni, but using a non-alcoholic vermouth that they made, or vermouth style product that they made, and a non-alcoholic bitter that they made, and then served at the world's 50 best bars and restaurants, I think. And so that was a sort of the first opportunity where we saw that there was an opportunity for something to behave like the alcoholic equivalent and behave it at that moment. And so perhaps that was also the starting seed for Aecorn as well.
So yeah, I think, before we talk about the range and, talk about how these products and how these drinks are going to turn up in the market, there's just a little question that I've got in the back of my mind, which is just around the choice of saying we're going to kind of go after the aperitif market. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've never developed a drinks product myself, but, I imagine that, the drinks you're talking to, I'm thinking perhaps like sherry, they don't say we are an aperitif, and that opens up the market really for them to turn up in many different ways, like going after the cocktail, or going after whatever market they may choose to kind of go after in the future. And I just wonder if just talk a little bit about that strategy of saying we are the aperitif, and were there potentially risks there in not so much pigeonholing yourself, but maybe ruling out a sort of a pivot further down the line. But I just think it would be really great to just to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I hope you haven't made a mistake. No, I think your comparison to sherry is an interesting one, because I think we know what sherry is, and sherry's been around for thousands of years, I think, hundreds at least. Yeah, a long time. But we're new, and we will not be defined by, the alcohol labels, because that's not what we are. So perhaps our closest equivalent would be vermouth or a bitter liqueur, and we don't meet that criteria. We are our own sort of unique expression of an aperitif. And the benefit of saying that we're an aperitif is that it's very broad. So it can mean many, many things. And this is our interpretation of what an aperitif is in the non-alcoholic space. Because I think it's tempting to say, oh, we're like a non-alcoholic vermouth. But then ultimately the consumer will come to us expecting a vermouth style experience and be disappointed because we're not that. But there is very much sort of this freedom in, not having to follow those rules, so that we can play in lots of different territories. And essentially, as long as there's food and friends and connection involved, then the aperitif, however that shows up, is appropriate. So that is why it's a good label for us in a sense. And there's familiarity there. So particularly in Europe, we will understand what an aperitif is. A little bit of education to do here, but I think it gives us much more freedom to experiment, to show up in different ways, and to educate around what this aperitif means, and the fact that it can mean so much more than just the drink that you have before dinner. It's the drink that sets the scene and the tone for the evening to come, and all of that great potential. And it's the drink that brings people together and is very convivial. So I think if we were too rigid and said we're a non-alcoholic vermouth, ultimately we would disappoint people. And we're actually more about opening up the opportunity rather than closing it down.
So yeah, we've kept you in suspense long enough. So I think just talk to us about sitting here as we are, end of July 2019. What is the range? What is going to be available, and what is that sort of first release, I guess, of drinks going to look like?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, we launched 12 weeks ago, and we launched with 3 products, so a dry, a bitter and an aromatic, and they're all based on an oaked verjus. So I don't know if you're familiar with verjus, but verjus means green juice. Typically in Europe in particular, where there's an abundance of grapes, a green harvest would occur, which is when the grapes are harvested before veraison, when they change colour, and those grapes are pressed, and the juice is used predominantly in Europe in cooking, because it's very bright and acidic and has a lot of complexity to it. And so we use English sparkling wine grapes grown in Sussex that are a combination of Pinot Noir, Meunier and Chardonnay. There's no green harvest in the UK in English sparkling wine, because the wine industry here is still pretty small and growing exponentially, which is exciting, but the yields are not at a level where a green harvest is necessary. So you normally find a green harvest when there's lots of grapes and you want to concentrate the energy into the vine, but here there's no spare grapes, which was a worry when we were launching the brand, or we were creating the brand 18 months ago. But fortunately we work with a wonderful grower in Sussex who grows these fantastic grapes, and we press them early to give us the resulting juice that we use. We then add botanicals from all over the world, but our sort of featured ingredient is acorn, because that is a British bittering ingredient that was very traditional, used back in the 1600s for digestive purposes. And this ingredient, sort of the acorn and the oak as well, those two are fundamental ingredients for us. Oak and grapes, go hand in hand, and how great they are together. And so for that reason, we use English oak in all of the products. But we also use acorns as a sort of bittering ingredient. And we have dry, which is very crisp and green and elegant. So black tea and quassia for structure, and then really green herbaceous ingredients such as clary sage, nettle and chamomile. And then we've got aromatic, which is aromatic. So cola nut and and cola nut, vanilla, clove and cassia. So really warm, indulgent, sort of quite nostalgic ingredients. Some English oak there as well, and some smoked cherry wood, which is phenomenal with those sort of very sweet, indulgent ingredients. That one behaves more like a sort of sweet vermouth style, and the dry behaves much more like a dry vermouth style. And then we have bitter, which is red and bitter, and so therefore is bitter. And we have in that gentian, quassia for the bitterness, and we balance this with complex citrus, so orange peel, grapefruit peel, kinotto, and we then use bay, which really roots all of those sort of citrusy ingredients and makes them a little bit more earthy, stops it from becoming too confected. And Sancho pepper, which is a citrus pepper, which reinforces all of the lovely citrus. So everything, something for everybody, we hope.
It genuinely does sound incredible, and I love the fact that it's bringing together so many different elements there in terms of, you know, the history and the, basically blending for me the historical element of aperitif and, you know, our own history and our own sort of culinary and drinks-based history here, but also being very much aware of the market and how people's trends are going and, you know, the people eating perhaps more together, being a bit more mindful about eating and what they're drinking. You know, it just seems like a really exciting project to bring those two together. And I guess the natural next question is just to give us a little bit of an insight into either how you might recommend people to drink those, or even just, you know, what's sort of feedback? How are people kind of getting into these that have had access to these aperitifs, I guess, ahead of the release? Yeah, sure.
So I think for us, you know, we want to keep it quite simple because these are sort of new products and there's still some education to do. But the spritz is, I would say, a drink that works across all of them. It's a drink that we almost instinctively know how to make, and there's something elegant about the wine glass and drinking a cocktail or a drink in that way, that also speaks to food as well. So the spritz works across the board, and the spritz for us is something, as I say, served in a wine glass, lots of ice, topped up with something effervescent, and depending on your flavour preferences, it can be anything from soda through to tonic, through to sparkling, non-alcoholic wine, of which there are some quite nice ones now. So really, you know, that's our sort of simple serve. It's also, as I said earlier, very complementary to Seedlip. So that hero drink for Seedlip and ourselves is the Negroni. So equal parts Seedlip, Aecorn bitter and Aecorn aromatic, served Negroni style. And then we're seeing sort of really great use in bars across the UK. The Savoy and Lioness were two of the first bars to list Aecorn. And they're using it in a variety of drinks, both non-alcoholic and also using it to lower the ABV in some of their classic cocktails or standard cocktails.
Yeah, as ever, you know, final question. I do always kind of invite you to look ahead, but I think in your case, of course, answer and talk to whatever is exciting. But I think it would also, for the listener, it'd be helpful just to get an idea of, you know, where these drinks, you know, going to be available in the first place, and be sort of maybe a little bit speculative about, you know, where do you see this developing, you know, going forward?
Yeah, great. Yeah, so as I said, we're very new, but we had an amazing start. So we launched with Selfridges in the beginning and really sort of echoed the footsteps of Seedlip in their beginning. They launched in Selfridges, as did we. So that was a fantastic sort of stepping stone into the last few months. We're now available in over 100 bars, like some really wonderful bars, as I've mentioned. And, you know, for us, the future is now to make sure that it's a product that's easy to get hold of. We don't want to create something that's very London-centric. We don't want to create something that's very sort of bar-centric. And so for that reason, we will be going into Waitrose next week, so from the early August. So national distribution in Waitrose, so That's exciting. And we're looking at sort of broadening distribution across Europe, and then obviously looking at international soon, as soon as possible. Because the goal for me is, as I said, or Ben said back in 2017, we want to change the way the world drinks. And change for me really means that a few years from now, we don't want to be having a conversation around non-alcoholic as a sort of new, novel thing. It should be mainstream enough for us not to be talking about it and just be talking about great drinks, great flavor, great complexity, great choice. And so really for us, the job to do is to ensure that we help grow this category properly and at pace, doing the right things at the right time with the right partners. And that Waitrose is a very important partner for us in that respect, to ensure that this is a product that everybody can have access to. So the future is to sort of make non-alcoholic the same sort of thing as being vegetarian. Vegetarianism a few years ago, or even veganism to an extent, you go into a restaurant and you might have one meal, one dish, and it's sort of the bottom, languishing at the bottom of the menu. And to an extent, we would like to see non-alcoholic menus not languishing at the back of cocktail menus, but perhaps better integrated or even brought sort of more forward, so that people feel as though they are included. And so that's our ultimate goal. So change for us means making that term non-alcoholic obsolete. We shouldn't have to have dry January or Stoptober. It should just be something that's integrated into our everyday life, because there's more great options for us. So getting it in everybody's hands, drinking hundreds of millions of spritzes and having fun while doing so. That's the mission.
Thank you so much, Claire. It was an absolute pleasure having you on. For all the details on Aecorn Aperitifs, do see their website listed below. I've also included details of their main social media handles. And of course, I'd love to have you following along and subscribing to the podcast. For all the info on how you can do so, do check out interpretingwine.com/listen. This episode unfortunately marks the end of my first mindful drinking series, and I would love to have some feedback from you. Do contact me. I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next series.